Good evening and welcome to St. George's House and the latest in our series of conversations with distinguished people from public life. It's a great pleasure tonight to welcome Gavin Lord Barwell as our guest. Gavin was, of course, Chief of Staff to Prime Minister Theresa May from immediately after the 2017 election until her departure from office in 2019. But before that, Gavin had been MP for Croydon Central from 2010 and had served as a government minister during that same period, not least as a very distinguished and much missed Minister for Housing. He is also the author of a book, which I hope you can see behind me, Chief of Staff, Notes from Downing Street, which I have to say is a terrific read, not least because Gavin was Chief of Staff during one of the most turbulent, traumatic, and indeed tumultuous times, not just in UK politics, but in European and indeed global politics. I think we would need a week to cover all the ground that he covers in that book, whether it is Brexit, Donald Trump, military intervention, conflict throughout the world. It really is a huge and hugely interesting canvas. Gavin, welcome to St. George's House. And I thought I'd start by asking you about the role of Chief of Staff, because I think we associate it primarily with the United States of America. So I think our audience would be interested to know just what that role involves.
Well, first of all, Gary, thank you very much for inviting me to be with you this evening. You're right, the Chief of Staff role is a relatively recent import from the US. It's been a feature in US politics since the time of President Nixon. But in the UK, the first Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister was Jonathan Powell, who did the job for the whole of Tony Blair's premiership. I think the question, what does it involve, it's a difficult one. I actually asked the Prime Minister that question when she offered me the job, and there isn't a job description. It depends, I think, on the nature of the Prime Minister, what they want from the person that they appoint, your own skills that you bring to the job, and the needs of the situation. But I think there are probably 4 or 5 bits to the job that are common to everybody who has done it. The first is that you are the most senior political advisor to the Prime Minister. The second is that you manage the team of political advisors in number 10 Downing Street. There's about 40 maybe political advisors typically in number 10. And in a slightly looser way, the other political advisors who are spread around the other government departments. You are a physical gatekeeper. Your desk is right outside the Prime Minister's office. So provided that you are at your post, people cannot get in to see the Prime Minister without passing by you. I think probably one of the most important roles is to speak truth to power. My experience is that the number of people who are prepared to tell the Prime Minister something that the Prime Minister doesn't want to hear is pretty small. Possible in the current government, it's 0. But that, I think, it's a key part of the job. That someone is able in private sometimes to say to the Prime Minister, this is a mistake, you shouldn't be doing this. So I would say that's another key function of the job. And then finally, working with the Principal Private Secretary, who is the senior civil servant in number 10, you kind of co-manage the building, essentially. So those of you who are old enough to remember Bernard in Yes Minister terms is the person I'm talking about. But you work very closely with that person to try and get the team of political advisors and civil servants to meld together into one harmonious team that supports the Prime Minister.
Okay, well, now I want to take you back to just before you became Chief of Staff, and really the night of that 2017 election.
Yeah.
You're MP for Croydon Central. The votes are hemorrhaging. You're going to lose your seat. You probably think at this point, I'm out of politics. But what went wrong with that election? Because she came from a position of strength.
So it's an interesting one. You used the phrase, Gary, the votes were hemorrhaging. Actually, my vote went up. I got the highest of the three elections that I stood in. I won two and lost one, and I got the most votes in the one that I lost. But you're still right in the basic tenor of your question, which is that at the point at which the Prime Minister called the election, she was way ahead in the polls. And for the first 2 or 3 weeks of the campaign, she was in a completely dominant position. And then what went wrong, I think, is two things, one of which is fairly well known and one of which I think is less appreciated. The first is the Conservative manifesto, which contained a number of proposals that completely changed the tone of the campaign, principally around social care, requiring people to contribute more to the cost of their care, but also promising a vote on fox hunting, means testing, the winter fuel payments. There was a whole variety of things in there, which both upset a number of traditional Conservative supporters and put off a number of normally Labour voters who had been thinking of switching over. So that really changed the whole tenor of the campaign. The other thing, which I think he probably doesn't get enough credit for, is that Jeremy Corbyn, who wasn't very well known at that point, did a very effective job at increasing the Labour vote. Now, I would be very clear that 2 years later, once people knew him better, he was a major drag on the Labour vote. But one of the things I find interesting is that Corbyn supporters just like to talk about 2017, his detractors just like to talk about 2019, and the truth is slightly more complicated, that in 2017 he did bring some people out to vote that didn't normally come out to vote and boosted the Labour vote. By 2019, when people had a better understanding of him as a politician, that wasn't the case. So I think it was the combination of the sort of disastrous Conservative manifesto and Corbyn running a successful campaign that meant that it was one of those very rare elections where the polls at the end were not the same as the polls at the start. Normally, the campaign doesn't make much difference, but on this occasion, it did.
It did. So in the circumstances, you feel you've lost your seat, you're out of politics. The next morning, the phone rings. What was the sequence of events that brought you back into number 10?
So the result gets declared in the early hours of Friday morning. So I think I got home about 6:30 on Friday morning, went to sleep for 5 or 6 hours, got up Friday afternoon, hundreds of text messages, either from friends offering commiserations or journalists inviting me to go on and say some disobliging things about Theresa May and the campaign that she had just run. So I did 2 interviews the next morning, one for the Today programme, one for BBC Breakfast News. And as I emerged from New Broadcasting House and was walking down Regent Street, I got a call from number 10 saying that the Prime Minister wanted to talk to me. And my assumption was that she was ringing around the 30 or so Conservative MPs who had lost their seats to offer her commiserations. And that's exactly how the call started. And then she said something, I can't remember the exact phrase, but rather it was something like, anyway, I'm in a bit of a hole and I need to make some changes at number 10 and I'd like you to come in and be my chief of staff. And it was, caught me completely by surprise. I had, as you say, I had assumed that my time in politics was done and I needed to go and find something else to do with my life. So I paused because I was so surprised. And whoever it was that had suggested to her to ask me to take on this job, I think had warned her that I had young children and that I might not say yes. So she sort of very quickly said, I'll understand if you don't feel able to do it. And I said, no, Prime Minister, of course, if you want me to come and do this job, of course I'll come and do it, but I do need to talk to my wife and family about it first. So it was a sort of surreal thing that I went from 24 hours earlier thinking I was out of politics and that was me done, to being offered this amazing job just 24 hours later.
Right, so you had an interesting call from Theresa May and then an interesting conversation with Mrs. Barwell.
Yes, so I had when I had given my concession speech at the Counts, I had ended by saying that the only silver lining to losing was that my wife and my children would see more of me. So I was it was not an easy conversation to have with my wife, but to be fair to her, she's always been hugely supportive of what I do. So she saw at once this was an amazing job that neither of us would ever have anticipated that I would get to do, and she gave me her blessing to accept it.
And so when you're in number 10, of course, there's a reduced majority, so a deal has to be done, and the confidence and supply deal is done with the DUP. And I just wondered about that, really reading your book, you know, the Northern Ireland peace process, the Good Friday Agreement, the Belfast Agreement, such a fragile flower, as it were. Was there concern in Number 10, or indeed throughout government, that this could do damage to that process?
Yeah, we were very worried about it. And we were worried about it for two reasons. One, the Good Friday Agreement requires the UK government to be even-handed to both communities. And obviously there would be a perception that if we went into some kind of arrangement with the DUP, that would involve taking sides. But secondly, if you remember, Gary, at that point, devolved government in Northern Ireland had collapsed. Yeah. And we were desperate to get it back up. And there was a fear that if the DUP were part of some arrangement at Westminster, that would make them less inclined to see the devolved government restored. So we were worried about both of those points and worked hard to try and ensure that the agreement addressed those concerns. I mean, I think in our defense, it was really the only option in town. Well, we didn't have a majority. Without some kind of agreement, we couldn't form a government. And there wasn't really anyone else to go to. Labour were obviously not going to do a deal with us. The Liberal Democrats weren't, given their experience 2010 to 2015, and there was no chance of the Welsh or Scottish nationalists doing it either. So the choice was really to find a workable arrangement with the DUP, or there would have to be another election. It didn't feel like that was in the country's interest either. So the honest answer to your question is we were all uncomfortable about it, but we felt it was really the only option to provide a stable government. And all we could do was to try and make sure that the way in which we structured the agreement addressed the concerns. And I think short term, it didn't work. People were worried about it. I hope that long term, people would feel that Theresa absolutely maintained that even-handedness to both communities, and the things that people were worried about when the deal was agreed actually didn't come to pass.
Yeah, and did that translate simply into money?
Yes, I mean, I would be honest about that. Absolutely. There were one element of the deal was some increased funding for public services in Northern Ireland. But I suppose I would say two things about that. One is, to a degree, that kind of pork barrel has always been a part of politics. It's not particularly edifying, but it's always been a part of the way politics works. And also, what the DUP were asking for was money for key public services in Northern Ireland. So you felt, well, okay, you know, this is not going to look great, and people are going to comment on it. But actually, they're not asking for things that are purely for the benefit of their community. They're asking for things that probably all the parties in Northern Ireland think are good for Northern Ireland, and so that made you feel a bit more comfortable about it.
And of course, the deal with the DUP was far from the only deal that the government was involved in at that time, because the whole Brexit negotiation, I'm almost terrified to bring up the word, was in full flight. And it's great. I mean, where your book is terrific is that insider view of the negotiations and the machinations. And I thought it would be very interesting just to hear something about that, because Theresa May in the end didn't get her deal through, and yet from my reading of it, 95% of the deal we have is her deal.
Yeah. So I think what proved to be the case was getting the deal through Parliament was much harder than actually negotiating the deal. The basic problem, I won't bore everyone with all the detail, technicality of it. At a high level, the basic problem that Theresa May had is that she was trying to sell a compromise. Her view was the country had voted to leave by 52% to 48%. That result was clear, but it was close. Mm-hmm. And of the four nations that make up the United Kingdom, 2 had voted to leave and 2 had voted to remain. And therefore, the right answer was some kind of compromise that delivered the key things that people who voted to leave wanted, but maintained a reasonably close relationship with the EU, and in particular was good for the Union of the United Kingdom and avoided any new borders springing up. And I don't know how much you want to go into this, but obviously the most difficult bit of the negotiation was about Northern Ireland. It was about, you know, what do you do to avoid a border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, which is the logical consequence of us leaving the European Union. The logical consequence of us leaving, certainly if we left the single market and the customs union, was that there would be a border between the UK and the EU at all of its external borders. But clearly, the effective removal of that border was a key component of the Good Friday Agreement. So we couldn't see that come back. And Theresa's argument with the EU was it would be equally wrong to put a border between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, because in the same way that nationalists would find a border north-south offensive, unionists, as has been proven, would find a border east-west offensive. And therefore she was trying to find a compromise that avoided borders either north, south, east, west. And she found herself in a sort of pincer movement between some people who basically thought Brexit was a mistake and wanted a second referendum in the hope that it could be reversed, and other people, Boris Johnson at their head, who thought that you couldn't compromise on Brexit, that you either did it properly and broke totally free from the EU, or it wasn't worth doing it at all. And she was ultimately unable to sell that compromise.
Right. But it seems in retrospect a bit rich. Boris Johnson, you can't compromise, otherwise it's not worth doing. I mean, this is a man who wasn't sure whether he was for it or against it at the start.
Yeah, so that was one of my frustrations with it. He was harder over than some of the people in the cabinet who had campaigned for Brexit all their lives. They were more prepared to compromise than he was.
Yeah.
And of course, what he was advocating, so what he was going around telling people, what we should have is a sort of Canada-style trade deal for the whole of the UK with no Northern Ireland protocol. And he said, if I was Prime Minister, I'd be able to get that. He wasn't. So, I mean, it was a very frustrating period, partly because Parliament and the country as a whole was so polarised, so that selling a compromise wasn't easy. But secondly, because a whole load of people were putting forward solutions that were just completely non-negotiable. I can remember very clearly, any of the people watching who've ever watched the House of Commons, there's a little box in the corner where the civil servants that are advising ministers sit. So I can remember sitting in that box when the Prime Minister was setting out the deal. And basically MPs got up to say one of three things. Most Labour MPs said the withdrawal agreement is okay, but the political declaration on the future relationship is just a political agreement. It's not a legal treaty, so it's not worth the paper it's written on. Well, the EU was very clear it was never going to negotiate a legal treaty on our future relationship until after we left. So that was impossible to deliver. Then you have Boris Johnson and the DUP saying, we've got to get rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol. Well, the EU was very clear they were never going to sign an agreement without a Northern Ireland Protocol. And then you had some MPs getting up and saying, I'm not going to agree to anything unless it preserves exactly the same trading rights that we have at the moment. Well, you can't leave a club and then say, but we're insisting on having all the rights that we used to have when we were in the club. So I was sitting there thinking, virtually everything that we're being told we need to go away and do to improve this deal is completely impossible to deliver.
So just thinking now, and I don't want to dwell on this much longer at all, but given the current debate, do you think a resolution can be found to the problems with the protocol?
So I think it is possible to improve. I don't like this protocol, and I have every sympathy with people in Northern Ireland that are cross about it. It's exactly what I feared, and this is why Theresa didn't want to agree this deal. The problem is we agreed it as a country, so the EU is not just going to agree to rip it up and start again. I think it is possible to improve it. So if there is a will on both sides to compromise, then I think it is possible to reduce the scale of the checks, but it's not possible to get rid of it altogether. And if the government and the DUP continue to insist on that, then it's going to lead to a major breakdown in our relationships with the EU. I wouldn't describe my position with the DUP as one of sympathy, but I at least understand what their problem is with the protocol. The government is in a more difficult position because, of course, it fought an election 2 years ago saying this was a wonderful deal, and it's now trying to tell the EU it's a terrible deal that isn't working at all. So you can kind of understand why the EU finds that a bit frustrating.
Yeah, it's a story to be continued.
Yeah.
And let's look a bit more globally now, because your tenure as Chief of Staff also coincided with the great disruptor, President Trump in America. And how did that impact on the relationship with the British government?
So, I mean, the first thing to say is that President Trump was an Anglophile, and would certainly have seen himself as wanting to be helpful on a wide range of issues. The problem was that in some areas he was changing US policy in a way that was contrary to UK interests. You know, initially there was a real concern about his commitment to NATO. There was a moment where it looked like he was going to withdraw US forces from Syria, which would have completely undermined our counterterrorism operations there. And then even in areas where he wanted to be helpful, it wasn't actually as helpful as he thought he was. So on Brexit, for example, he was a supporter of Brexit and he wanted to help us on that. But because the EU knew he was hostile to them and wanted other countries to follow our example, he couldn't play that sort of mediator role between the two that any other US president almost, you know, if President Biden had been president during Brexit, almost certainly his administration would have said, well, look, we're friends with the Brits, we're friends with the EU, we don't want them to fall out, so we're going to try and help both sides come to some kind of compromise. But President Trump wasn't able to play that role because the EU didn't see him as a sort of neutral arbiter on this question. So, you know, I don't want to be overly negative because the president in many ways was a strong Anglophile, but his policies in a number of areas were actually contrary to long-standing UK foreign policy positions, and his unpredictability a little bit in terms of how these things would come out made it incredibly difficult to do.
Yeah. Can you see him back in the White House?
Yes.
Okay.
So I mean, I think people are way too complacent about that. I think that if it had not been for the COVID pandemic, he would have won the election. And you know, if you look now at the polling in America, he's clearly the favored choice of Republicans to be their candidate next time. And, you know, Biden is not polling particularly well at the moment. So it is definitely possible that you could see him back. And more importantly, because we tend to dwell a bit too much on Trump, the personality, I think it is highly likely that we will have other American presidents who share his policy agenda. And even Biden, who is very different from him in some areas, there are some areas of continuity. If you look at policy on China or policy on Afghanistan, Biden is basically continuity Trump on those two issues. So, you know, I think we need to get the message as a country that the last 3 US presidents have been sending us, which is that they're not interested in playing this global policeman role anymore. And they're not interested in intervening in places where they don't see US interests as being engaged. So they're still committed to European security, but their main focus is the Pacific, it's China. And, you know, if the UK and Europeans think their interests are engaged in places like the Sahel or Afghanistan, then we're going to need the capability to do things on our own without the Americans, because we can't rely on the Americans anymore to be with us on those kinds of areas.
And you mentioned just a moment ago, very briefly, Syria. Which must have been a very difficult time in government, morally as much as anything else.
Yeah, so I think probably most people listening would accept me saying that Theresa May is a deeply serious person. And when she takes decisions, she thinks them through very clearly. It doesn't mean that all of the people on this Zoom will agree with her on every decision, but she does what she thinks is best for the country, and she makes sure she's across all the detail. And that was absolutely the case with that decision. The questions that she asked were twofold. One was there a legal basis for intervention? Once, if you like, the security officials had presented compelling enough evidence that chemical weapons had been used by the Assad regime against their own people. Questions were, was there a humanitarian basis for intervention? And if there was, would it be effective? And you get into some quite tricky legal arguments, Gary, because President Trump, Obama, if you remember, had declined to use military force.
Yeah.
There had then been an attack in, I think it was 2017, where Trump had fired a cruise missile at one Syrian airbase. And that didn't stop Assad doing what he was doing. So you were in a position where, in order for the legal tests to be met, the intervention had to be big enough that it would credibly degrade the capability of the regime and deter future use, but not so big that it would be disproportionate and risk escalation. And so these questions are, you're right, there's a moral element to them, but there are also technical legal elements to them about calibrating exactly the right level of response that is going to achieve the policy goal, which makes what you're doing legal in terms of international law.
Right, but beyond the legalities of it, Gavin, I'm just wondering if in number 10, with Theresa May, with yourself as Chief of Staff, was there a certain amount of anguish over going down this route?
So I think in Theresa's case, she wanted to get the decision right. So I wouldn't use the word anguish. I think there was just a huge attention to detail to get the decision right. I was very nervous about it because, you know, at this point, the Prime Minister has outstanding advice from her national security and military officials about what the position is, what the options are that are available to her. My job really was to try and think, as her chief political advisor, what are the politics of this? And my nervousness, Gary, and I have to be a bit careful what I say here, because I know things that the government wasn't able to make public. And so I found myself in this sort of poacher turned gamekeeper position. I remembered the dodgy dossier, Iraq, you know, thinking, well, can we really trust what the government is telling us? And then you find yourself sitting in number 10 and being informed of things that give you confidence in the judgments that you're making, but you're not able to tell the public all of the things that you know. And so, you know, that what worried me was, how are we going to convince MPs and the general public this is the right thing to do in a situation where we can't tell them all of the evidence that we have at our disposal?
Okay. Okay, thank you, and I respect, of course, that there are things you can't tell us about. Now, we did have a couple of questions which came in from people who are with us this evening, and one of which is someone who says, "I know you're a master. I know you as a master of campaigning strategy. What was your most difficult moment as Chief of Staff to Prime Minister May?" Which I think is a very good question.
It is a good question. So maybe I can cheat slightly by giving you two or three. I mean, I think the simple answer to the question is the hardest moment is, you know, in the moment at the end when it's your job to say to the Prime Minister, "I think the game's up," because that's obviously not an easy conversation for either you or the Prime Minister at that point. But I think that's probably not a very revealing answer. So I think the other two moments that I would pick out would be one you've just touched on, which was the decision to commit military forces to action in Syria because of the serious, you know, when you take those decisions, you know that it is going to cost some human lives, and you cannot guarantee, you do everything you can to ensure that no innocent civilians are going to be caught up, but you can't guarantee that. So I wouldn't want someone as Prime Minister who found that decision easy to take. Although I also wouldn't want someone at Prime Minister who wasn't able to take those kinds of decisions if they're necessary to keep the country safe. The other moment that I would probably pick out is a particular moment in the Brexit travails, which was quite early on, and I pick it out because I think it was a important moment for my relationship with Theresa. So if you remember, this would have come just before Christmas in 2017, and we were just sort of finishing the first phase of the negotiations, and she had flown out on the Monday to agree what was called the joint report, and then had to come back because the DUP had said they wouldn't support it, and we spent a frantic week trying to get some changes made that would allow the DUP to support it. And we got to the point that we had to get out there by the Friday morning, I think it was, and this was sort of late on the Thursday night. She got off the phone to Arlene Foster, and Arlene was clear that we had improved the document, but she still wasn't saying yes. And the Prime Minister had to make a decision about whether she was going to go and risk it and sign it anyway, or refuse, in which case I think we'd have been in real trouble. And so I had this conversation with her where I said, look, I kind of feel conflicted here because I have to give you two different bits of advice. On the policy, I think the right thing to do is to go and sign this thing. But as your chief political advisor, I have to tell you there is a non-negligible chance that this could lead to the end of your premiership. You're taking a huge political risk. And, she thought about it and said, I agree with you, it's the right thing to do for the country, and I'm going to go and do it, and we'll take the risk. And there's a lovely, some of you may remember, there's a lovely photo of her boarding an RAF plane at about 3 in the morning to go out and see Juncker and agree this deal. And the photo sort of captures a couple of the qualities in her that I really admired. There's a sort of certain stoicism and a determination to do what she thought was right. As I said, not everyone on this call will agree with her on every issue about whether she was right or not. But I think I can put my hand on my heart and say she always did what she thought was the right thing rather than the politically convenient thing. And if you're going to give up virtually every waking hour of your life working for someone, that's an important, you're never going to agree with, if you work for a politician, you're never going to agree with them on every single issue. I think the best you can hope for is you believe that their motivation is good.
Okay. And another question I've had in is about the special advisors, the SPADs,
Yep.
So-called. And I suppose we most prominently think of Dominic Cummings, where you have somebody who seems to be determining government policy, who's unelected, basically, which in itself seems to fly in the face of democratic government. How can that be avoided in future?
So I think that the important thing, if you're a special advisor, the important thing to remember is your staff. You're not a principal. It's not your job to decide government policy. It's not your job to try and get what you want to happen done. You're there to advise the Prime Minister and then make sure what the Prime Minister wants to happen gets done. And I've known Dominic. I don't know him well, but I've known him for a while. He's a very bright, intelligent person with lots of interesting ideas. But that quote he gave in the interview with Laura Kuenssberg, where he said, shortly after the election, he and others were plotting about how to get rid of the Prime Minister. I mean, that is outrageous. Mm-hmm. Prime Minister, whether you like Boris Johnson or you don't, the Prime Minister had just won an emphatic general election victory. He had a clear mandate to be Prime Minister. And the idea that someone who is meant to be his most senior advisor was actually thinking about ways of getting rid of him, I mean, that is something deeply wrong there. I think we've spoken once before, Gary, and I think at the time I gave you this quote that I picked up from a book about the Office of Chief of Staff to the President of the United States, where James Baker, who was Reagan's Chief of Staff, says, the job title is Chief of Staff, and you need to remember the important word is staff, not chief. Mm.
But as we have seen, hell hath no fury like a spad scorned, with Cummings. And I've got a couple of other questions here, one of which takes you back to your time as Minister for Housing. And it is fair to say that you kept housing on the agenda while you were Chief of Staff as well. That was something that you brought to the Prime Minister's attention. And our questioner asked, what is your view on this government's obsession with the right to buy and the right to shared ownership, when many of our young people who can't get into this market at all might be better with a right to rent rather than the other two, and that this might contribute much more substantially to the levelling up agenda?
So one of the things that frustrated me most about housing policy when I became housing minister was that we get into this slightly ridiculous either or debate in this country about renting or ownership. So, I'm obviously, my politics, I'm centre right. So I think it is a good thing to spread ownership of property as widely as we can in this country. I think if you have a society where, say, only half of people own and the other half don't, then over time the wealth gap is going to open up. You're going to widen the wealth gap between them. So I'm all in favour of trying to help people to own property. But you also have to recognise there's lots of people that aren't going to be able to do that. And there's some people who don't want to do it, and they need decent, affordable, secure places to live as well. So, and Theresa was absolutely on the same page on this. We had inherited a housing policy that was all about ownership. And what we tried to do is say, look, we're still absolutely in favour of trying to help people to own their own homes. But we also want to build more homes for people to rent as well. We just want to build more homes of every kind, because we've got a housing crisis in this country. And actually, we're going to need a mixture of different kinds of homes in order to solve that crisis. And one of the things that people who aren't involved in housing don't appreciate is you actually build out new housing quicker if you have a mix of tenures. If I gave you a bit of land and said, right, Gary, go away and set up a company that's going to build 1,000 homes on that land, all for sale, there is a limit to how quickly you'll be able to sell them in the market. So you'll only be able to build them out at a certain pace. Whereas if you're building a mixture of outright ownership, shared ownership, and rental accommodation, you'll be able to build out the site much quicker because you're tapping into several different markets when you're trying to to move on those homes essentially. So I suppose the thing I would say is it's not an either or choice. And absolutely we need to build more homes for rent, but that doesn't mean it's a bad thing to try and help people get on the ownership ladder as well. We can do both.
Okay, and I've got a question here as well, which is very London specific, but it comes from an honorary alderman and past mayor of the London Borough of Croydon.
Oh.
So that's why I think I must put this one before you. And he says, given your extensive experience of local government prior to becoming a member of Parliament, do you think that the many changes to service delivery within the metropolis over recent decades has rendered the structure of London's local government no longer fit for purpose? Does it need a radical overhaul or a complete restructuring?
So I've always believed that London has too many councils. We have the city and we have 32 boroughs. And I've always thought a structure where we had fewer larger boroughs would work more effectively. And I certainly agree that some of the changes that have been made in the last 10, 15 years have probably strengthened the case for those kinds of reforms. The pandemic should teach us several things. One is we need better integration between the NHS and the social care system. But secondly, it should teach us some lessons about what things are best done nationally and what things are best done locally. So to give you two obvious examples at either extreme, it takes a national government to have a vaccine procurement strategy that gives the NHS the volume of vaccine doses from a number of different candidates to ensure that we were able to run the vaccination program that we are. If you're trying to run a track and isolate system, that is much better done by local public health teams that have knowledge of local communities than trying to set up some structure centrally that doesn't start with any of that sort of historic knowledge at its disposal. So, I'm a big fan of local government. I want to see it empowered more, and I do think in London a reform would be a good thing. I don't think it's particularly likely. So the probably the more relevant question is, how do we improve what we've got? But if I'm asked the question, yes, I would move to fewer larger boroughs.
And just picking up on the reference to COVID, we're moving into the winter now. The scientific and medical advice seems to be go for plan B, go for it quickly, go for it now. The government is resisting that. And I see it daily on trains. People aren't wearing masks. They're not doing this in shops, etc. What seems to be coming from government is very much a mixed message. Would you agree with that? Do you think there is a better way?
Yeah, so look, I would disentangle several things here. So the first is the scientific advice, I think, is quite complex. The latest projections seem to suggest that they think cases might come down naturally because so many people have been infected recently. But if you look at what's in Plan B, I think you can disentangle it. The first thing is mask mandates. I see no reason not to say people should still be wearing masks in certain settings. It doesn't do any damage to the economy. It is about protecting each other and minimizing risk. I don't think it's going to make a dramatic difference. Actually, the numbers are not that different in Scotland where they have a mask mandate. So we shouldn't pretend it's the solution to all our problems, but it must help at the margins. And I see no reason why we shouldn't be doing it. I think the other two parts of Plan B are more difficult. The sort of COVID passport idea will have some economic impact on the event sector, and the working from home guidance will have some impact on white collar workers and those businesses that would be affected. So I think the judgment, and Patrick Vallance, I thought, put this really well, is, it may be that if we only do the mask mandate, things will naturally take care of themselves. But if they don't, and it carries on getting worse, then you need much more draconian interventions to get the numbers down. So maybe it's better to do some things now, even if maybe you didn't need to avoid the risk of having to do some more draconian things down the line. But I think we should accept that these are difficult judgments, whereas I think last autumn, it's very clear the Prime Minister got it wrong. And March 2020, it's very clear that not only the Prime Minister, but the whole kind of system was too slow to realise what was happening and too slow to lock down. So I think, that the original wave, the autumn wave last year, it's clear mistakes were made. Whereas now, I think if you read what the scientists are saying, it's a more mixed picture, but most people are saying probably better to be cautious and move to plan B, even if it might not be required, than to risk getting it wrong and then need more severe interventions.
And just thinking of the other C word at the moment, COP26,
Yeah.
There's a huge amount riding on this, not just for the planet, but for the UK, of course, as host. Do you think Boris Johnson can pull this off?
So I think we will get an agreement that will take us forward. I don't think
it be enough.
Not to where we need to be. If the target is to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we are not going to get there at this conference. I think that's clear. I don't know if you saw, Gary, but China published what's called their nationally determined contribution today, and it was a step forward, but it was not anywhere near what we would need to keep 1.5 degrees alive. So I'm afraid that our politicians are moving, but they're not moving quickly enough. And this is some of what you're going to read in the media over the next few weeks is a bit simplistic. It's a complicated picture because you can look at it one way and say, well, China, India, they're the big emitters and they're the ones not doing enough. But of course, if you look not at the current picture, but who is responsible for the carbon that's been put in over the atmosphere over the last 200 years, it's European nations, the US, that bear a significant responsibility. So the argument is going to be, how much money are we willing to stump up, given our historic responsibility to help developing countries make this transition, versus what are the major emitters of today? How quickly are they prepared to decarbonize? And my fear is that where we're going to end up is in what I would call a sort of panicked transition. But what's going to happen is, we do some more compared with Paris, but it's not enough. And as more and more of us begin to see the impacts of climate change in the world around us, public opinion shifts, there's a sort of panic about it, and then you try and transition in a rush, which is economically much more damaging than doing it in a managed way over 30 years or so. So, I don't want to be too despondent. I think we will make some progress at Glasgow, but I don't think it's going to, the scale of the response, I don't think is going to be what it needs to be given the seriousness of the challenge.
Yeah, but I suppose in one way, some progress when the clock is ticking, so very clearly ticking, some progress but not enough is essentially a failure, isn't it?
Yeah, it's not what we need.
Yeah.
But if I've learned anything in politics is that you very rarely achieve perfection, and you just have to keep. I suspect what will happen is they won't say we'll meet again in 5 years. They'll say we'll meet again in 2 years. And kind of, this is a sort of dance between politicians and the public, because what a lot of politicians will be worried about is, well, if I agreed to go the whole hog and did all the things necessary to get to 1.5 degrees, I might well get voted out of office. And it sounds, when we talk about it on this kind of call, it sounds like 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees isn't very much. But in terms of the amount of reduction in emissions that's required over the next 10 or so years to achieve that, it's huge. It's something like taking a China out of the global economy. And that would require some really quite radical policy steps. And I think, I hope I've given a sense of my passion that we need to do this. But I do think politicians need to level with the public a little bit more here. There's a little bit of an attempt to pretend this is all some wonderful job creation scheme. The truth is, the net cost of decarbonising isn't that high, but there's a lot of upfront cost with savings that come down the line. So it is not an easy, politically, it's not going to be an easy thing to do. People are going to have to pay more, and we can argue about who pays more and how the burden is shared across society, but there are going to be some quite significant upfront costs.
Okay. And of course, that would lead me, but we're running out of time, into yesterday's budget, but we're not going to go there, because I want to ask you one last question, Gavin. St. George's House, as you know, is concerned with leadership. That's really what we're about: leadership of thought, other kinds of leadership. You were Chief of Staff to Theresa May. Boris Johnson is now Prime Minister. How would you compare them as leaders?
So I think that between them, they have many of the qualities you would want to see in the perfect Prime Minister. So, you know, I touched earlier that and what I admire about Theresa in terms of her dedication to public service, her attention to detail, the work that she put into the job, and the fact that she was in the job for all the right reasons. And I think the Prime Minister has many of the communication skills that you need in a modern political leader, in order to be able to tell people a sort of convincing narrative about what his government is for. So I suppose, having seen it up close, it is an incredibly difficult job that requires such a wide array of skills. It's probably no coincidence that we struggle to find somebody who's perfect at it, because there probably isn't anyone that could do all of the different bits of it perfectly. But you know, I think the work that you do is really important, because leadership does not just come in from politics. You know, there are leaders in all sorts of different sectors who I think can play an important role in something. I work closely now with PwC, and I look at the work that Kevin Ellis, our senior partner, does on social mobility, and he is providing real leadership on that issue. And if I give a non-trivial example, I'm a very passionate Liverpool Football Club fan. I think you would struggle to find a much better leader in any sphere in the world at the moment than the current manager of Liverpool Football Club, who I think, not just as a manager of a football club, but if you look at some of the things he has to say about the issues that are going on in the world at the moment, I think he provides outstanding leadership. So leadership is an important quality in politics, but in other fields as well. And thinking about what makes effective leadership, I think hopefully the book shines a little bit of a light at that, but it's a really important dialogue to have.
Great, thank you. Well, as a Liverpool fan, you must have had a very good weekend last weekend. Gavin, thank you very much. Let me just finish by thanking our audience for joining us tonight. It's a pleasure to have had so many of you tuning in, and I hope you've enjoyed the conversation. And Gavin, let me thank you in particular for giving us your time. It's been terrific. I said at the start we could go on for hours, and we certainly could, and I would love to, but I'm not going to take up any more of your private time. The last thing I would say is that Christmas is coming, and if you want to read a book that really gets to grips with recent political history, not just in the UK, but across Europe and the globe, then I really do heartily recommend Chief of Staff, Notes from Downing Street. All it remains for me to say to each and every one of you is thank you, keep safe, keep well, and from St. George's House, good night.